From a pampered dog into a wild dog. So far, Buck has faced some of the most hardest challenges of this life. But what's coming next is even harder. It will test Buck to his breaking point, and it will eliminate almost everyone. Will Buck survive this challenge, or will it be the end of Buck's journey? Watch this video till the end, because what happens at the end will change everything forever. Buck and his team, once loyal to their previous master, have now been sold to two new men, Hal and Charles. But their journey has only just become darker. For 30 long days, the saltwater male pushed through the frozen wilderness, finally crawling into the rough town of Skagay. Buck and his team were not greeted as heroes, but as worn-out shadows of themselves. Buck, once strong and proud, had lost much of his weight, and the others were in even worse shape. Pike, who used to fake injuries, now limped for real. Sol-Lex dragged a hurt paw, and Dub could barely move with his injured shoulder. Their bodies told a story of endless work. Their paws were raw, their muscles shook with every step, and their eyes were dull with exhaustion. They weren't just tired, they were completely worn out, both inside and out. In 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles. For the last 1,800 of those miles, they had only rested for 5 days. By the time they arrived, they looked like ghosts, barely able to stand. "Mush on, poor sore feets," the driver said softly as he urged them down the street. "This is the last one. Then we get a long rest, eh? A nice long rest." But that promise was not to be. The mail had to move quickly, and fresh dogs were ready to take over. Buck and his team were sold to the highest bidder. They were no longer brave sled dogs, but tools to be used and discarded. 3 days later, rest turned into a cruel joke. Two strangers from the south bought the team. Their names were Hal and Charles. Charles was a man with weak, watery eyes and a mustache that drooped as sadly as his personality. Hal, younger and full of himself, acted like a tough guy, carrying a gun and a knife he clearly didn't know how to use. With them came Mercedes, Charles's wife and Hal's sister. She wasn't made for the wild. Dressed in fine clothes that didn't belong in the north, she spent her time fussing and complaining. Her voice was sharp and never-ending, making things even harder for the already struggling group. From the moment they packed their sled, it was clear these people didn't know what they were doing. The sled was overloaded, piled high with useless things. A local man couldn't help but laugh and give advice. "That's quite the load," he said, grinning. "But I'd lose that tent if I were you." Mercedes gasped. "No tent? How do you expect me to survive?" The men and others chuckled, knowing spring made a tent unnecessary. But Mercedes insisted, so the tent stayed. The sled became a towering mess of canned goods, blankets, and other luxuries. When Hal finally yelled, "Mush!" the dogs strained against the harnesses, but the sled didn't move. Hal, impatient, grabbed his whip and snapped it at the dogs. "Lazy brutes!" he shouted angrily. Mercedes cried out and grabbed the whip from him. "Don't you dare! They're trying their best!" Buck watched all this with unease. These people were foolish and careless. He had survived many challenges, but his instincts told him they were heading for trouble. Finally, with help from the townsfolk, the sled's runners were freed from the ice and the dogs managed to pull it. But before long, the overloaded sled tipped over, spilling everything onto the street. The dogs bolted and the team scattered. The townspeople helped gather the dogs and offered more advice. "Half the load, twice the dog," someone said. But Hal and Charles ignored it. After hiring 6 new dogs, untrained and weak outsiders, they set out again. These new dogs were no match for the seasoned team. They didn't know how to pull, and they lacked the strength and endurance needed for the trail. Buck and the other Huskies resented them, but had no choice but to push on. Hal tried to fix the growing problems by feeding the dogs more, but soon supplies began to run out. Mercedes, feeling sorry for the animals, secretly gave them extra food, making their rations disappear even faster. One by one, the dogs began to fall. Dub, his shoulder too damaged to keep working, was the first to go. Hal shot him without hesitation. The new dogs followed, unable to handle the cold and hunger. As the dogs suffered, so did their owners. The tension between Charles, Hal, and Mercedes grew with every passing day. They argued over everything: whose fault it was, what to do next, and how to survive. Mercedes refused to walk and insisted on riding the sled, which made the dogs collapse under the extra weight. When forced to get off, she threw tantrums, sitting in the snow and refusing to move until the others dragged her along. The harsh wilderness stripped away any kindness or patience they might have had. By the end, they were nothing but angry, broken people who didn't belong in this unforgiving land. For Buck, this was the worst chapter of his life. He had survived so much already, but now he faced a new test. The trail was cruel, and the people leading him were worse. But Buck carried on, step by painful step, determined to survive no matter what. After traveling 3 miles, the group unloaded the sled, went back for Mercedes, and forced her onto the sled again. They were so overwhelmed by their own misery that they ignored the suffering of the dogs. Hal believed that hardship toughened people. He had tried to teach this to his sister and brother-in-law, but ended up taking his frustration out on the dogs with his club. At 5 Fingers, their dog food ran out. A toothless old woman offered to trade them some frozen horsehide in exchange for Hal's revolver. This hide, stripped from starved horses months earlier, was a poor substitute for food. Frozen, it was like eating strips of metal. Once swallowed, it thawed into tough, stringy leather and clumps of hair, causing irritation and providing little nutrition. Through it all, Buck stumbled at the front of the sled team as if trapped in a nightmare. When he could pull, he pulled. When he couldn't, he collapsed, only to be beaten back to his feet. His once glossy coat was dull and matted with dried blood. His body, now just skin and bones, showed every rib and muscle. The other dogs were just as miserable. They had become walking skeletons, so numb that they barely reacted to the whip or club. When they stopped, they dropped like lifeless sacks, only to be forced up again when beaten. One day, Billy, the kind-hearted dog, collapsed and couldn't get up. Hal, having traded his gun, used an axe to end Billy's life, cutting him from the harness. The dogs, including Buck, saw this and knew their end might be near. The next day, another dog, Kuna, died, leaving only 5 dogs. Joe, too weak to snarl. Pike, limping and dazed. Solex, loyal but frail. Teak, fresher but beaten the hardest. And Buck, staggering blindly at the front. Despite the beautiful spring weather, none of them noticed the melting snow, budding trees, or singing birds. Life returned to the wild, but for the humans and dogs, it felt like a march to death. They stumbled into John Thornton's camp by White River. The dogs collapsed, Mercedes cried, and Charles sat stiffly on a log. Hal, speaking for the group, dismissed Thornton's warning about the dangerous melting ice. "They told us we couldn't make it, but here we are," Hal said smugly. Thornton replied grimly, "The ice can give way at any moment. Only luck brought you here. I wouldn't cross it for all the gold in Alaska." Hal, ignoring the warning, ordered the dogs forward. But Buck didn't move. The whip lashed him, but he lay still, sensing doom ahead. Hal switched to a club, but Buck remained unmoving, his body too broken to feel pain. As Hal's blows continued, Buck's spirit dimmed. Finally, Thornton snapped. With a roar, he knocked Hal backward. Standing over Buck, Thornton growled, "If you hit that dog again, I'll kill you." Hal tried to argue, but Thornton didn't budge. Hal pulled a knife, but Thornton disarmed him with the handle of his axe and cut Buck free from the sled. Defeated, Hal and the others left with the remaining dogs. Buck and Thornton watched them go. Moments later, they heard a scream. The sled and team fell through the ice, vanishing into the river below. Thornton turned to Buck, knelt, and said softly, "You poor thing." Buck, too weak to move, licked his hand. Over the next weeks, Buck slowly regained his strength in Thornton's care. Lying by the riverbank during the warm spring days, Buck healed, his muscles filled out, and his coat became sleek again. Thornton's 2 other dogs, Skeet and Nig, quickly befriended Buck. Skeet, a small Irish setter, took on the role of nurse, licking and cleaning Buck's wounds every morning. Nig, a large, cheerful half-bloodhound, was equally kind but less expressive. Together, they played with Buck and coaxed him into games, helping him recover. For the first time, Buck felt true love. Thornton wasn't just a kind master, he treated his dogs like family. He spoke to them warmly, played with them, and cared deeply for their well-being. Buck adored Thornton, often lying at his feet, watching his every move with devotion. Sometimes Buck would gently bite Thornton's hand, a playful gesture of love that Thornton understood and welcomed. Despite this love, the wild spirit within Buck hadn't faded. He remained fierce, cunning, and dominant, especially with strange dogs. He had learned that survival in the wild meant showing no weakness. Buck had become a creature of the wilderness, guided by instincts as old as time. While he lay by Thornton's fire, the echoes of his ancestors seemed to live within him, shaping his dreams and his connection to the wild world around him. Every day, Buck felt the wild call of the forest growing stronger. It was a sound that pulled at him, calling him to leave the warmth of the campfire and the familiar ground around it. The more he heard the call, the stronger the pull became. He felt like he needed to leave everything behind and run into the forest, but whenever he stepped into the trees, he remembered his love for John Thornton, and it always brought him back to the camp. John Thornton was the only person who truly mattered to Buck. The rest of mankind didn't mean much anymore. Some people would try to pet him or praise him, but Buck didn't care. If someone got too close, he would walk away. Only Thornton had Buck's loyalty. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on the raft, Buck didn't pay much attention at first. He didn't care about them until he realized they were with Thornton. After that, he accepted them, but only because they were with his master. They understood Buck didn't need close bonds with anyone else. Thornton's bond with Buck grew stronger every day. No one else could ask Buck to carry a heavy pack or do something tough without Buck doing it willingly. One day, as they sat on the edge of a steep cliff, Thornton jokingly pointed to the dangerous drop below and said, "Jump, Buck!" Before anyone could react, both Thornton and Buck were dangerously close to falling, but Hans and Pete quickly pulled them back to safety. Thornton, shaken, said, "It's incredible, but also scary. It makes me afraid sometimes." Pete, wide-eyed, said, "I'm not going to mess with you while Buck's around." Hans agreed, "Not me either." But danger didn't always come from the wild. One night in Circle City, Buck's protective instincts kicked in. A man named Black Burton had been causing trouble at the bar, picking a fight with a newcomer. Thornton stepped in to stop him. As usual, Buck was watching closely. Without warning, Burton punched Thornton, knocking him off balance. Buck didn't wait. He lunged at Burton, knocking him to the ground. Burton tried to fight back, but Buck was too strong. Buck bit into his arm, then went for his throat. People rushed in to pull Buck off, but Buck didn't stop growling, pacing around until he knew Thornton was safe. The people of the camp saw that Buck had only defended his master, and they decided that he was in the right. From that moment, Buck became famous in every camp in Alaska, known for his strength and loyalty. Later that year, Buck saved Thornton's life again, in a way that was even more dangerous. They were traveling down a fast-moving river on a small boat, with Hans and Pete guiding them from the shore. Buck, as always, stayed close to Thornton, watching his every move. But then, disaster struck. The boat got caught on some rocks, and Thornton was thrown into the water. The current was too strong, and Thornton was carried downstream toward the dangerous rapids. Without thinking, Buck jumped into the water after him. The current was powerful, but Buck swam with everything he had, trying to reach Thornton. But the water was too strong, and Buck couldn't get closer. Thornton shouted, "Go, Buck! Go!" He was telling Buck to leave him behind and save himself. But Buck wouldn't give up. He kept trying to get to Thornton, no matter how strong the current. Hans and Pete quickly came up with a plan. They tied a rope around Buck and sent him back into the water, hoping he could reach Thornton. Buck knew he couldn't mess up again. This time he swam straight into the current, fighting with all his strength. Finally, he reached Thornton, but the struggle wasn't over. Hans and Pete managed to pull Buck and Thornton to the shore. Buck was nearly drowned, but the men quickly worked to revive him. Buck stumbled to his feet, tired but determined. When he heard Thornton's voice calling for him again, he didn't hesitate. He ran back to the water, ready to try again. This time, Buck swam straight and strong, reaching Thornton and pulling him to safety. It wasn't easy, but Buck had succeeded. He had saved Thornton's life, just as Thornton had always saved him. Buck had done the impossible, and once again, his love for his master had made all the difference. As Buck's journey takes darker turns, we're reminded of the true cost of survival and loyalty. What happens next will change everything he's fought for. But the wild has more in store for him, and the final test is closer than ever. What will be Buck's ultimate fate? Let us know in the comments how you think Buck will overcome what's coming next. And if you want to see how this incredible story ends, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss part 4, the final chapter in Buck's wild journey. Until next time, the call of the wild grows stronger, and Buck's destiny awaits.